Hi, everybody. Welcome to yet another episode of IFPD Podcast, which is called Diplomacy Unplugged. I will quickly request Ifsha from Team IFPD to introduce our speaker for the day. Ifsha, please.
For today's session, we have with us Dr. Arpita Anant, a research fellow at the Vivekananda International Foundation. She has a PhD in international politics and specializes in India's multilateralism and global governance. She has received prestigious fellowships, including the ICSSR Doctoral Fellowship and the Commonwealth Visiting Fellowship. She has several publications to her name and has extensive expertise in international politics and diplomacy. A very warm welcome to you, Dr. Arpita. We're happy to have you with us. So let's get started. Over to you, Tanya.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Ifsha. Once again, ma'am, welcome to our podcast series. We'll dive right into it. Now, Ifsha did mention in your introduction multilateralism and one of your expertise and areas of research. We were very keen to understand, especially in today's times, what is the actual value that multilateralism holds? Do you think that today's times require this as an approach? And with that being said, is there a significance in India's foreign policy approach of multilateralism?
Okay, thank you for having me here, first of all. So let me get right to answering your questions. You see, the world today is characterized by interconnections and interdependence. So acts of one nation have impact on several others. Moreover, there are challenges like climate change and pandemics, which affect people across the frontiers and require coordinated actions. Multilateralism, which is based on the fundamental principles of consultation, inclusion, and solidarity, is therefore of great significance today. So far as the element of multilateralism in India's foreign policy is concerned, I think we've had a very substantial element of multilateralism in our foreign policy. India's tryst with multilateralism began when it became a founder member of the United Nations, and India continues to be a strong supporter of the UN and most of its institutions even today. Over the years, under the umbrella of this whole of the world multilateralism, as it's called, India has actively engaged in creating smaller multilateral forums with selective membership, such as the non-aligned movement and the G77. It has also associated itself with regional organizations in different parts of the world. So that's association with multilateralism of a slightly different nature again. Some examples being the SAARC, the BIMSTEC, the ASEAN, and the SCO. Then it has become a member of cross-regional plurilateral organizations or forums, such as the G20, the BRICS, and the IBSA. And finally, you have very small multilaterals called the minilaterals, such as the Quad. So each of these fulfills certain requirements, not only of India, but also the world. So multilateralism is an important component of India's foreign policy, and it also complements India's bilateralism.
Definitely, and that's such a important sense of the statement. Why? Because this year was extremely crucial for India, given that we held the G20 presidency, the secretariat. It is also an important multilateral forum in these times. And I mean, if you just look at countries, especially like the African Union joining us this year, we have so many other multilateral forums like the B20, the W20, T20, correct? And in that sense, I feel like these groups sort of chime in all sorts of issues that our leaders discuss, especially at an international level. How do you think that these steps that we have taken to invite newer countries, for instance, the African Union, have sort of taken things to a new level to address issues and to address those blind spots that we have when it comes to any issues that are being left of the global south or elsewise?
Okay, that's a very interesting question. The G20 has indeed come a long way since it was formalized in the current format in 2008. But this has happened in more ways than the ones you have mentioned in your question. So I'll dwell on those other ways in a little while. But first, let me speak about the aspects that you have mentioned in your question, which is the participation of non-G20 countries, international organizations, and the civil society. So let me just begin by saying that this itself is not a new phenomenon. So in the London summit in 2009, for instance, the chair of the new Partnership for Africa's Development, the chair of the ASEAN, and the president of the EU Commission were invited to ensure regional representation. Also invited were the heads of the UN, the World Bank, the IMF, the WTO, and the Financial Stability Forum. So today what has happened is that the number of these international sort of organizations has grown. Secondly, when it comes to non-G20 countries, it's very interesting that it was decided in 2010 during the South Korean presidency that non-G20 countries would be invited, but the total number would not exceed 5, and of which 2 had to be from Africa. That was the first step. And today, with due credit to the Indian presidency, like you've said, we have the G21. So it has come a long way. Then, as far as the engagement groups like the B20, C20, T20 are concerned, they too were conceived a long time back. In fact, the business leaders of the world were invited to give their inputs to the G20 finance ministers during the Canadian presidency in 2010. And then they came together as the B20 by 2011, which was the time of the French presidency. The Global Trade Union, again, was associated with the G20 process since 2008, but became the L20 in 2011. So other groups came to be formed along the way, and the inclusion of each of them has been very significant. The Indian presidency, as you know, has formalized the Startup 20 engagement group this year. So now, having said that, let me dwell a bit on how the G20 has come a long way in some other important ways as well. So the first step is that from being a forum of finance ministers and heads of central banks, since 1999, 2008, it becomes a forum of the leaders as well. So the Leaders Summit starts happening in 2008. The second step was the inclusion of ministerial level meetings, beginning with the Labor and Employment Ministerial in 2010 and the Agricultural Ministerial in 2011. Now let me dwell a bit on how G20 has come a long way in some other ways. The first step, I think, was the addition of the Leaders Summit to the G20 process, which happened in 2008. And so the G20 was extended beyond being a forum of finance ministers and heads of central banks of the top 20 economies in the world. The second step was the inclusion of ministerial level meetings, beginning with the Labor and Employment Ministerial in 2010 and the Agriculture Ministerial in 2011. The third step, in my view, was the Seoul Summit of the G20 in 2010, which was the first one to be hosted by a country that was not a member of the G8 club. And it was here for the first time that it was decided that, having dealt with the financial crisis and while continuing to cope with its after effects, the G20 would turn its focus on issues of the developing countries. They adopted the Seoul Development Consensus for Shared Growth, which committed the G20 to assisting the low-income countries to achieve growth. Since then, the finance track got complemented by the Sherpa track, and the agenda of the G20 expanded greatly. And finally, is the intensification of considerations of vulnerable sections of the society, climate change, and technological requirements of sustainable development, of which the finest manifestation, I think, is the New Delhi Declaration that was adopted on 9th September this year. As you mentioned in the beginning, each of these is an attempt to address some very serious issues and channel the strength of the leading G20 economies to address them. So Each of these steps, India's included, have plugged certain holes.
In that sense, ma'am, we also felt that for our viewers and our listeners to tune in, at a global level, when we say that multilateralism has far-reaching effects, correct? One of the reasons we also talk about is how multilateralism is trying to combat counter-terrorism, or for that matter, combat rather I should phrase it better. It should be combating terrorism and promulgating counter-terrorism. In that sense, we have a lot of committees being set up. BRICS has a counter-terrorism committee of its own. How do you think that such effects that multilateralism has created, or ripple effects, have been in achieving counter-terrorism in today's times?
Okay, so if one looks at the UN's efforts in combating terrorism, then one can see that the General Assembly, with the Global Counter-Terrorism Strategy adopted in 2006, lays out a common strategic and operational approach for member states and regional bodies to follow. Its 4 pillars relate to the adoption of preventive measures, such as reducing factors that lead to terrorism and capacity building of states to prevent and combat terrorism. It also spells out ways in which human rights should be protected while combating terrorism. The UN Security Council, on the other hand, works through the Counter-Terrorism Committee and its Executive Directorate. And together they criminalize support to financing of terrorism and harboring of terrorists. They monitor the implementation of these measures by states. Then there are also subsidiary bodies that list individual terrorists and supporting organizations and impose travel and assets freeze. So this is what is happening within the UN system. Another important multilateral effort that is outside of the system, though connected with the UN, is the Financial Action Task Force, or the FATF, and some FATF-style regional bodies who work to stop the flow of funds to terrorist groups. So the FATF actually has been extremely effective in curbing the flows of funds to terrorist movements all over the world. Now, you mentioned the BRICS. The BRICS Counterterrorism Working Group seeks to increase collaboration between the BRICS countries to counter terrorism. The working group was established during India's presidency in 2016, and the BRICS Counterterrorism Action Plan was adopted again during India's presidency of the BRICS in 2021. So these multilateral initiatives, in my view, have been quite successful in combating terrorism. Their successes cannot be recounted in the open domain. There are too many things that are happening and not all can be revealed in the public domain. But on the whole, the big success, I think, has been in creating a whole ecosystem against terrorism all over the world. They have adopted measures to keep up with the ever-morphing threats of terrorism. So from Al-Qaeda to the Daesh, to countering radicalism and violent extremism, multilateral forums have found ways to deal with them. Today, for instance, the focus is on preventing the use of new technologies by terrorists. So these multilateral initiatives are constantly evolving to deal with the new challenges. And I think therein lies their significance.
Okay, ma'am, what do you think has been India's role in shaping the global discourse on counter-terrorism?
India has been a very important voice in the global counter-terrorism discourse because it is a country that has suffered from unending cross-border terrorism. Much before the UN came up with the measures that I just mentioned, India had proposed the adoption of the Comprehensive Convention on International Terrorism in 1996. So this is much before 9/11. The CCIT was the first instrument that was envisioned to take the UN beyond the adoption of declarations on terrorism. It sought to criminalize state support to terrorism. The CCIT has, of course, not been adopted due to opposition mainly from the OIC countries, which want the CCI of armed forces of the state in the purview of the CCIT. And many other countries are not willing to do so. So, however, many of the measures adopted by the UN since then have been in the spirit of the CCIT. I think India has also been a leader in the discourse on condemning terrorism as a violation of human rights, because mostly the human rights discourse has been, against the state, whereas India has said consistently that terrorism is a violation of human rights, and it has to be recognized that terrorists are also perpetrators of human rights violations.
We also know, ma'am, that India has been playing a significant role when it comes to its participation in multilateral organizations. One area of emphasis is the UN peacekeeping operations. There have been growing calls for reforms within the UN to change and enhance its practicality and its inclusivity. What potential contributions can India make to instigate these changes, especially in today's times?
Okay. I think the most important aspect of India's contribution to peacekeeping has been the large number of peacekeeping troops it has provided. As you know, at one point in time, India was the largest contributor to peacekeeping operations on an annual basis. The role of India's troops has been exemplary. There is, however, another important way in which India has contributed to the discourse on peacekeeping. The UN has a special committee on peacekeeping operations. It's called the C34. India has been a member of the C34 since its formation way back in 1965. India has constantly highlighted the concerns of troop contributing countries and the need for incorporating their inputs into mandates of peacekeeping operations, not only in the C34, but also in the UN Security Council. Then different aspects of peacekeeping are discussed in the 4th, 5th, and 6th committees of the General Assembly. And here too, India has been very active in participating in them. Then more recently, India has been very vocal about security of peacekeeping personnel themselves. And in 2021, India launched something called the Unite Aware in collaboration with the UN. This is a situational awareness software program that uses modern surveillance technology for real-time threat assessments to peacekeepers. So it has been very passionate about supporting its troops and therefore this initiative. So overall, I would say that India's way of engaging with peacekeeping has been one of strengthening the existing multilateral system. India will and should remain engaged with the issues of peacekeeping.
Definitely. And India, I think, overall has been doing a lot in terms of voicing the opinions of the global south. And with that being said, in the end, we just have one tiny question for you. People have been talking a lot about safeguarding the South or the global South's interests, and India is viewed as having played a very, very significant part in this. Can you elaborate on India's historical as well as the current role in advocating the voice for the global South? Any concerns, any issues, any challenges? And what do you think that India has done to fulfill the expectations? Do you think India has done justice?
Yes, India has certainly been a big supporter of the Global South. The most recent example, of course, is the first ever summit of the Global South held during the Indian presidency of the G20. It has never ever happened. So that was one instance, of course. But then there is a whole history to this. And India's solidarity with the developing world, as it was called then, goes back as far as India's independence, in fact. And ever since India's independence, India has given a strong support to movements of independence in many parts of the world. At a bilateral level, I think India has done something very substantial. It initiated this ITEC program, and which supported basically training in developing countries. And this was way back when India itself was plagued with many, many issues. So, but that initiative continues till date, and today is a very substantial initiative. Then since 2012, India has set up something called the Development Partnership Administration, which coordinates the SciTech and other development assistance programs that India has as part of its what it calls development cooperation. Now, multilaterally again, India has battled for the common cause of the developing countries as part of larger multilateral coalitions such as the G77 and the non-aligned movement. Under the rubric of South-South cooperation, way back in 1993, India suggested the launching of 7 model projects, which would help countries of the developing world in the non-aligned movement especially, to set up important projects to do with energy, connectivity, etc. Then there was a prominent group of 15 countries within the non-aligned movement worked together in the World Trade Organization to voice the concerns of the developing countries. New associations that were formed, for instance, the Indian Ocean Rim Association for Regional Cooperation that was formed in 1997, and the IPSA in 2003 also focused on helping with the development of developing countries. Within the UN system, India is the only country to have set up the India-UN Development Partnership Fund in 2017. So you're absolutely right. There is a long history to India's engagement with the Global South. I don't think there are too many concerns on this count. We have to do much more in terms of implementing these things on the ground much better. But overall, I think it's been a substantial contribution. India is obviously not the only country to do so. But it is important to note that while it does so, it addresses several of its own developmental needs. And it's very creditable that despite our own needs, we are able to step up and contribute something, whatever we can, to the development of the Global South. So starting from being a part of the Global South, India is today placed somewhere in between the North and the South. India espouses the cause of the Global South without actually denying the agency of the countries of the South. So it terms its own engagement with the South as a partnership. So I think it has a long way to go, but it has also covered a lot of ground.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for those insights. With that, we'll wrap this up and extend a very, very big thank you to our speaker for joining us and sparing all the time that she could today. Thank you so much. Now, ma'am, any concluding remarks, please?
No, thank you so much for giving me this opportunity. It's been a pleasure.